Yeah, I think this is like popular explanation, even that Medvedev is kind of doing this because he's drunk. And I saw when I was in France this summer for vacation, I saw French television, and they had some refugee Russian kind of journalist, female journalist, who said this is basically about Medvedev, that he's basically alcoholic and so on. This was explanation given about his statements, and I think this is a misrepresentation of this because his posts in Telegram on social media are, I think, very significant, kind of, and they should not be dismissed kind of as just some kind of drunken kind of talk, because I think he's for a number of reasons, because he's not only former president of Russia, but he's also deputy head of National Security Council, and his kind of posts, which he said that Russia could take away Odessa and other regions like Mykolaiv and even Kiev. I think this is, very serious and very omnibus development.
Oh my God.
Welcome to ArtiFact number 51. I have back with me Professor Ivan Katchanovski. He's professor of political science at the University of Ottawa in Canada. And we're going to be discussing something that has not really been in the news as much lately due to the recent conflict in Palestine, which is the Ukraine war. There have been some interesting developments as to, for instance, the specifics of the Maidan Massacre, which occurred actually when we recorded our show. I believe it was February 20th, 2023, which was the 9-year anniversary of the Maidan Massacre. So there have been some interesting developments corroborating large chunks of Professor Katchanovski's research on the topic. We're going to discuss the future of Ukraine. We're going to discuss the current status of the war. And I said this in the first show, but I want to just emphasize this again. One thing that I like about Professor Katchanovski is he's a sort of dissident that, you know, it's a kind of a dissident that I could respect in the sense that he was a dissident in the Soviet Union, Ukraine, and the USSR during his student days, right? He was a pro-democracy protester, pro-human rights, anti-censorship, things that were becoming more and more in vogue in the 1980s in the USSR. And after the collapse of the USSR, he wasn't one of those Soviet dissidents that then suddenly decided, you know what? Russia, 1995, or Ukraine, 1994, this is exactly what I've been working for my entire life, and then just kind of let go any activism. He continued on, and he still remains a dissident today. In my personal opinion, if you have the psychological orientation to be a dissident, you should be a dissident for the rest of your life because we need you. This applies to the arts. This applies to politics. If you solve one problem, there should be 1,000 other problems for you to solve after the fact, because if you run out of problems and solutions, honestly, what's the point of living? So I just want to start, I guess, with the Gaza conflict. And since that's been in the news, what exactly would the implications be for Ukraine? Is the attention just going to now completely ebb from Ukraine? Is it going to be a problem in terms of funding? We're already seeing some cracks in terms of Republican support for funding Ukraine. And obviously, with the way that America is, there's still a kind of element of austerity involved where if we fund one war, if we pay attention to one place, we're going to just necessarily pay less and less attention elsewhere. So maybe we could just start a little bit with that aspect of things.
Yes, exactly. The conflict in Gaza has a tremendous impact on the war in Ukraine and on the future of this conflict, which is, I think, would have major implications not only to Ukraine, but also to the European Union and to countries like the United States and the West in general and NATO in general, because of what's going on in terms of the outcome of this conflict and the nature of this war. And I think I can say, based on my own personal observations, there was a big decline in attention given to Ukraine, both by politicians, by the government officials in the West, in the United States, in Canada, in the European Union. And also, a lot of significant decline of the media attention, which was very important for Zelensky personally, because he's came from kind of entertainment industry. So for him, attention basically to be in the limelight, kind of to be the center attention, and to be on all the media, kind of major media outlets, giving television interviews and so on. So this was kind of his time, kind of, and his kind of I think what he considered to be his kind of life dream, basically, and fulfillment to achieve such status. And now he is replaced by events in Gaza and again in Israel, which I think started very important conflict itself, with a lot of implications also to how Ukraine war is perceived outside of Ukraine, because media attention obviously is declining, since in the United States, Israel traditionally is much more important in terms of history and in terms of connections compared to Ukraine. And so this is one of the reasons why there was such decline. But I think another reason was kind of much more significant human rights violations and what's going on in terms of destruction taking place in Gaza, and also killings by Hamas of Israelis, civilians, and so on at the start of the conflict, which had again very significant impact in terms of again human rights violations and actually which I think eclipse what's going on in terms of the civilian casualties in Ukraine, because now. Again, I'm not expert in Gaza and Palestine and Israel, but according to various media reports, again cited by kind of United Nations sources, I think, which are regarded as maybe kind of cited very widely. Actually, now number of civilian casualties is much now in just in Gaza exceeded a number of civilian casualties in the entire war in Ukraine, for again, which was very significant, especially children and so on. And I think this is a very significant impact how this war is perceived, not only again in Ukraine itself, because in Ukraine there was not much coverage of this conflict, but I think it was a very significant impact on how Ukraine war is perceived outside of Ukraine, specifically in the Western countries, in the United States, which provided much funding for Ukraine, but also European Union, and also countries of the South and Middle East, which countries like Saudi Arabia and other countries which were, I think, in Asia and Latin America, which were, I think, crucial to this conflict, because Western countries tried to kind of sway their public opinion and their governments in favor of supporting Ukraine. But now I think it will be much more difficult, and this is now recognized universally, that this will be much more difficult to kind of to provide funding to the Ukrainian government, military funding, military support, including weapons to Ukraine, because of the conflict in Gaza and implications of this conflict.
Yeah, and just to emphasize some of what you said, when it comes to civilian casualties in Gaza, it's now well over 11,000. Well, most of those rather are civilian casualties. I think the estimated number of Hamas militants is something like well under 1,000. I mean, that could change, but if 75% of the casualties thus far are children and women, right, it stands to reason that the other 25% of adult males, probably most of them are not Hamas fighters either, right? They're just part of the indiscriminate shelling. In terms of like rate of casualties versus Ukraine, so we have still under 10,000 civilian casualties in Ukraine, and here it's over 11,000. So we're talking about a pace of something like almost 20 to 25 times faster in terms of death rate. And obviously the child death rate in Ukraine is well under 1,000, and a substantial chunk so far of the confirmed deaths are children in Gaza, as well as under the rubble, right, which are not counted yet as deaths, but most likely will be deaths. That brings it up to closer to like somewhere between a third and half. And it's an interesting observation that you made about in terms of like what the U.S. sees as its strategic interest, in the sense that, we had Obama, who was a very mainstream figure, a popular figure. And one of his reasons for not arming Ukraine to the same level that Trump and Biden did was, we might want Ukraine on our side, but it's not really our core geopolitical interest, even in that region. So we need to sort of like let it go, not get really involved with Russia, right? This is kind of like, in their sphere of influence was the way that maybe that he would put it. And when it comes to something like Israel, right, moving away from Israel is still very costly for American politicians. In the end, who knows how that's going to play out? But, it's worth thinking about. In your estimation, do you think that Ukraine is being forced to play these like little like geopolitical games that maybe is going to come back to haunt them? Because like one thing I did notice last year was Zelensky, he went on social media, he went on Twitter, and he publicly congratulated Netanyahu on his election last year. And he said it in some terms like, Netanyahu shows us exactly how democracy looks like. This is real democracy. And I mean, this would make Zelensky look very clownish because, I mean, nobody liked really Netanyahu even then, especially not now. There's now this, kind of a thing going on with Russia where Russia is taking a more pro-Palestine position, not just nominally, but also just actively in some of the things that it's doing. It's seen Hamas leaders by Putin several times already. And, there's always this possibility of things going haywire. Like, is Ukraine being sort of forced to take sides in something that maybe can't really find a way to negotiate itself out of in the future?
I think your observation about Obama policy towards Ukraine in 2014, I think is very important and I think very relevant to the current war, kind of, and U.S. policy towards Ukraine and support for the current Ukrainian government of Zelensky, because when this conflict started in 2014 in Ukraine, and Russia intervened and annexed Crimea and supported separatists in Donbass. So again, it was a very dangerous development then, but there was no war between Russia and Ukraine, even so there was a significant possibility of such war taking place. And specifically, one issue why this did not happen is because the Obama administration told then Maidan leaders who came to power in Ukraine after the violent overthrow of the Yanukovych government, they specifically told them not to resist Russian annexation of Crimea by military means, and this is why there was kind of basically mostly peaceful. Just I think 2 people were killed during this kind of annexation of Crimea, which was pro-Russian in terms of its attitudes and supported joining Russia for a long time in the 1990s and especially after the Maidan. But I think, and for this reason, again, it was a very dangerous situation, and I warned about real possibility of war between Russia and Ukraine, especially in the months coming before the Russian invasion, because I expected this could happen, even so many people, I think most people did not believe this would be the case. But when the war started, I think I expected that this, again, that Zelensky would basically continue Poroshenko policy to make a deal with Russia to stop this war, because, again, Ukraine would not be able to defeat Russia militarily. It was quite obvious for a very significant time, even with Western weapons, with Western support. But I think it was very kind of difficult to predict for me that Western countries would resort to kind of proxy war, basically kind of blocking peace deal and in Ukraine and forcing or kind of making or pressuring Zelensky into accepting this proxy war, which again for the West is also very defeating, because for Russia this is a much more significant conflict compared to the United States, and Russia has military advantage, and this has now become obvious that proxy war, I think, would be not in the interest of Ukraine. And for this reason, again, a policy of Ukraine, including foreign policy, now to a large extent is dictated by its total dependence on the West. That's why Ukraine basically supported all resolutions of the voting in the United Nations, almost in all cases, along with the United States, concerning, I think there was last resolution concerning, concerning West Bank or something, or kind of Israel, in which Ukrainian delegation voted with majority of other countries, but in previous resolutions it voted along with the United States. Even so, there was very few countries supporting such resolutions concerning Israel. So, and Zelensky made explicit decision to support Israel in this conflict. and he wanted even to visit Israel. And initially, Israeli government told him that this is not the time for the visit. And later, just I think a few days ago, there was an announcement that Zelensky was planning to visit Israel, but he had to cancel his visit because of a media leak. So he wanted to make this visit like a public event, kind of to show support, and unexpected again to be again in the limelight. But Israeli media reported this in advance, and for this reason he canceled this visit to Israel, which again shows kind of open policy of supporting Israel in this conflict, kind of without any any objections or any kind of reservations, and also following the United States policy in this regard. And also Zelensky still says that he wants to visit Israel, and he might do this specifically to offer support to Israeli kind of policy and to Israeli government. And relations between him and Netanyahu was not quite fond, or quite friendly for a long time, because Israel, after the start of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, it tried to be kind of more neutral. It refused to provide military support to Ukraine in contrast to the Western countries, because it wanted to preserve relations with Russia, specifically in terms of Syria, and avoid confrontations with Russia in Syria, because Russia has anti-aircraft weapons systems in Syria, which can be used again against Russian military planes bombing Syria, various installations, various places and locations and so on in Syria. And for this reason, Israel did not want to explicitly support Ukraine in this conflict. And Zelensky now tried to basically sway Israel in supporting Ukraine, providing military weapons, but this would be again very difficult for Israel to do because of the conflict. So they would not provide any with this Iron Dome anti-aircraft, anti-missile system, which is again would not be also very useful in case of Ukraine, because of types of weapons are used by Russia, which are much more advanced compared to this Palestinian missiles, which are unguided and quite quite short range and so on. And again, Zelensky also explicitly said that he wanted to make Ukraine like a new Israel, basically state which will be supported by the West for a very long time, and would be basically again for a very long time conflict between Israel and Arab states and Palestine. So he wanted to do the same basically for Ukraine, to make Ukraine a Western bulwark against Russia for a very long time. And so this is like his explicit policy. And when he says democracy, again, I think Israel is again, I'm not expert in Israel, but Israel, you have multi-party system, elections, and so on. In case of Ukraine, Zelensky banned all opposition, all major opposition parties, with the exception of parties on the far right, and with the exception of the Poroshenko party and parties which are more nationalistic parties. And he again banned all the opposition television channels, including the Poroshenko television channel and so on, and left only one state basically run television, Marathon, which only gives Ukrainian news which are approved by the government of Zelensky. So this is actually not a real democracy. So actually Ukraine is not democratic in this regard, and as I mentioned, this is based on my research. So there is no democracy in Ukraine. Ukraine is largely undemocratic, and Zelensky is not a Democrat. He is basically trying to create his undemocratic rule and to hold power in Ukraine, especially because of forthcoming elections, which were supposed to be held in next March, next presidential elections. And Zelensky just decided that this is not the time for elections. So he makes his own decision, whether to hold elections to replace himself. So this is like how can anybody call this democracy? And there are people, even some academics, who say this is like Ukraine is democracy and so on. And for me, this is like Orwellian. This is quite unbelievable. because you have major human rights violations, you have opposition parties banned, you have political prisoners, you have just state media basically control television programs, and this is quite unbelievable. Now there are no even elections to be held, and this is considered to be democracy. And I think this is purely political kind of misrepresentation, which is, I think, also affected this war in Ukraine to a large extent because of propaganda, because open propaganda.
Yeah, Ukraine as the new Israel, very ominous in more ways than one. I'm going to have some more observations on Palestine when we go into our overtime segment for the patrons. But for now, let's just, I guess, talk about the main thing that happened recently, I guess, prior to the Gaza war, which is what is now just kind of like universally seen as Ukraine's failed counteroffensive. And we could get into some of those specifics, but I also want to know, like specifically about the counteroffensive. I can't really get a great handle on whether or not it was something that had just a great deal of appetite for within Ukraine itself, or if it was something that was just kind of like pushed on Zelensky, whether it's just kind of like directly or indirectly in the sense that, you know, he would have to sort of like really show something for the West, right? I get the feeling that if the counteroffensive really went very well, probably America would be more willing to, you know, fund them more and more. The fact that it failed, you know, it's kind of like, all right, time to start negotiating peace. So was this something that that Ukraine had a lot of appetite for, or was it something that was pushed on Zelensky, or is it some sort of like in between situation?
I think this was a decision both by Zelensky and by the West. And I think it's very important to kind of, as a political scientist and also as a Ukrainian, kind of to say that Zelensky is not a Ukrainian, so he's become associated with Ukraine and he speaks on behalf of Ukraine and all Ukrainians. But obviously, he's just one politician who is currently again president of Ukraine, but he's not able to speak on behalf of all Ukrainians or even to say what again kind of that he's basically Ukraine alone. And this is, I think, very important to distinguish, because this is specifically used to kind of justify this policy. Because if Zelensky says that he supported this counteroffensive, so this means, or any other policy of war, so this means Ukraine supporting this. But this is again in any country, this is like basically saying that Biden is the United States or Trump is the United States, and anybody who says otherwise kind of anti-American or something like this. So this would be obviously not kind of accepted or kind of. But in case of Ukraine, this is often deliberately conflated. And I think the decision to launch this failed counteroffensive was a decision by Zelensky and also by the West, because Zelensky wanted to have again another PR, public relations, kind of display to show again to the West and to show to Ukrainians that Russia again can be defeated. And I think he actually believes this, that he would be able to kind of defeat Russia because of flawed interpretation of what happened before. And the same, I think, Western countries also, and also he wanted to show to the West that that Western provision of military support, weapons to Ukraine and funding to Ukraine is justified, because he's able to kind of defeat Russia on this small territory, not entirely basically defeat Russia, but kind of, again, to inflict kind of severe damage on Russia and take some territory and move closer to Crimea. And he even predicted that Ukraine would be able to take back Crimea and Donbass, which is, I think, was totally kind of absurd even to think about, because I mentioned in all my interviews before this counteroffensive started, and in my comments on social media, that there is basically zero probability that Ukraine will be able to take back Crimea and Donbass from Russia. And this is, I think, what happened now. But kind of, so motivation by Zelensky were purely political. He wanted to kind of show to Ukrainians and to the West that, again, that he can continue kind of take back territory which was occupied by Russia during this war, even take back Crimea, which was annexed by Russia in 2014, and also even the territory of Donbass, which was again became controlled by separatists in 2014 with Russian support. But Western countries also specifically prompted Zelensky to launch this counteroffensive, even so they knew in advance that, again, Ukraine would not be able to defeat Russia. This was, I think, very obvious. Even Pentagon leaks disclosed this, that Western intelligence estimated that Ukraine would not be able to to take back even this area which connects Donbass with Crimea. Land bridge between Donbass and Crimea, and this was a main goal of this counteroffensive, and they predicted this would be very difficult to do this, and I think for this reason it was very obvious that Western countries also had intention, Western governments had intention to support this counteroffensive, also to show to the public that support for Ukraine is beneficial, that Russia is basically weakened. There is again is taken back by Ukrainian forces, and also to justify a policy of proxy war in Ukraine, because this is again basically Western countries use Ukraine as a proxy against Russia, and this was main reason for such a policy of the Western countries, Western governments. They do not support, actually. They do not care much about Ukrainians. They do not care about Ukraine per se, but they only consider Ukraine as an important tool against Russia. So this is why they gave all this money, all the support is basically to weaken Russia, to use Ukraine as a proxy against Russia. And head of the Pentagon actually was quite explicit about this policy. He said the goal of the United States is to weaken Russia, and that's why they supported this policy. Even so, again, it was obvious that this again would be very difficult to achieve. As I mentioned, the chances of this were close to zero, and the reason for this is because how previous events in this war in Ukraine were misrepresented deliberately by the media, by politicians in the West and in Ukraine, and including by Zelensky. So they specifically presented battles or warfare near Kiev when Russia, as a defeat of Russia near Kiev, and then near Kharkiv, and then near Kherson. So this was presented as basically as defeats, military defeats by Russia against Ukrainian forces, and this is what I think was major reason why a lot of people in the West believe that actually Russia is very weak and it will be easily defeated during the current counteroffensive, which is not the place, not took place, and it was quite obvious for me because I research these events daily. I watch hundreds of videos on the ground, looking to everything in terms of military events taking place, all the major battles and all major changes in front line and so on daily, and looking into different sources, different Telegram channels from different perspectives. And it was very obvious that there were no major battles, again, significant battles or significant military defeat by Russia near Kyiv or near Kharkiv.
Yeah, I will say that even as a layperson speaking to the idea of how much of this was fact, how much of this was propaganda in terms of cheering on the war or cheering on the idea of Russian weakness, even as a layperson, I remember starting in early summer of last year, just by the sheer volume of things that were coming out of both mainstream publications as well as journals. You had one study, I forget where this was, maybe this was actually last fall, where they were predicting within a year the total collapse of Russia due to sanctions. It just kind of struck me as, all right, it's too much too soon. Many of these really predictions are not really panning out in terms of really truly damaging sanctions. And you would see articles okay, it's a little, Russia's a little bit more resilient than we thought in terms of these sanctions, but this new tranche of sanctions that we're about to put on now, this is really going to cause a lot of pain, and it never really seemed to materialize. So I would say starting from last summer, we had plenty of reason to be skeptical, and that's not to say that we even had plenty of reason to be skeptical beforehand. And figures like John Mearsheimer, for instance, they always contended from the start that this would be more or less World War I style artillery trench warfare, and there's no way that Ukraine could win that simply, based on, rates of attrition, manpower, based on what the West can and cannot produce and or send versus what Russia is able to manufacture, that sort of thing. So there were always reasons, right, to be skeptical, but I think fairly quickly they start to pile on. And would you characterize the fighting that Zelensky has chosen to do? Because there seems to be, for a while now, like conflicts between himself and his generals, where he seems to want to do battles that maybe have symbolic value, but don't necessarily have a whole lot of military value. And maybe this is just kind of like a function of, Zelensky, if his strength is kind of like charisma or being like a showman, and the idea is Ukraine is facing this uphill battle. So his main task is to just get as many Westerners on his side as possible. So what's his strategy based on that reasoning? What did it go for kind of like showy attempts at victories? Like, for instance, the whole Bakhmut thing, right? Maybe I'm wrong, but it seems like it's not so necessary either to Russia or to Ukraine, but both Russia and Ukraine treated it as this kind of like huge symbolic thing where Russia sacrificed a lot of resources and people just to be able to hold on, and Ukraine was trying to win it back. So how would you characterize this kind of fighting?
Yes, I think exactly. And if I also briefly comment about, can respond to your comment about sanctions and efficiency of sanctions, it was very obvious even before this war, the sanctions would not be effective in changing Russian policy or ending this, or preventing Russian invasion or ending this war after Russia invaded. And I mentioned this in a lot of media interviews in Canada, television interviews before this invasion, in radio interviews, and in my comments. And after the war started, because these a very large volume of research by scholars, by political scientists who look into the effect of sanctions. And there are many other cases of many countries which were in conflict in the West and were subject to very significant sanctions for a very long time. You just look into examples of Cuba, North Korea, Iraq during Saddam Hussein, Iran, and Venezuela. So all the countries, again, did any of these countries collapse, or it was very easy to defeat? And actually, North Korea became nuclear power. It has a lot of weapons, which now I think they provide even to Russia. Iran the same. They were able to, again, to survive and again, able also to provide weapons to Russia. And I think in Cuba also kind of able to withstand all this blockade for a very long time. So in the case of sanctions, it was, I think, quite I think, again, for me, this is quite unbelievable. Basically, the people would believe that sanctions can have such effect because of studies, academic studies, but also many other examples of other countries which are much less developed than Russia and have much less resources, are able to survive even much more severe sanctions. So I think this was either wishful belief or thinking, or it was actually again propaganda, basically to justify such policy of doing something, actually and instead of another option, which would be not possible for the West, is to intervene directly in this war, because this would mean a war between Russia, which is nuclear power, and the NATO countries, including the United States, which are also nuclear powers, and which would mean, again, nuclear war and end of, basically civilization, a very significant damage to many countries with significant casualties, which I think is not acceptable from, again, not a real scenario for the West. And for Russia, I think also because of this. And I think in terms of policy of Zelensky, this is quite clear that he motivated by public relations, his own image, and his popularity, and his policy in this conflict. As I mentioned, again, he's tries to be in limelight. He tries to win support and show that he always winning and so on, and which explains a lot of his decisions, which had very negative consequences on the in terms of for Ukraine and future of Ukraine, and which led to military disasters, like in case of Bakhmut. Defense of Bakhmut for a very long time was a specific personal decision by Zelensky. He specifically mentions this in his interviews, that he gave order to for Ukrainian forces not to withdraw from Bakhmut, even there was a real danger of encirclement of Bakhmut, and a lot of there was a very significant number of Ukrainian casualties during this battle, and Russia also lost a lot of people, soldiers in this battle offensive, which was also motivated, I think, had political motivation, but Russia was relied on their Wagner company to take control of a battle over Bakhmut, and Wagner company, mercenary company led by Prigozhin, they rely on Russian prisoners. Basically, people who were recruited from prisons were sent to the battle, and in exchange for their sentence being reduced or lifted, so they would get amnesty for this. So a lot of casualties, I think. Very significant number of casualties, Russian casualties in Bakhmut, were were actually Russian prisoners who were sent to or joined Wagner company, specifically in exchange for promise of amnesty. And I think this is very different for Ukraine, because Ukrainian forces who were lost in Bakhmut were much more elite forces. They were regular military forces, and they and their loss is much more significant in terms of the effect on Ukraine and Ukrainian military, because a lot of most experienced members of Ukrainian military were killed in the Bakhmut defense, which again was, even Western countries told Zelensky not to continue this defense, but he decided to do this for political reasons, as he did the same with battle for Mariupol, when he gave order for Mariupol, again for Azov, and neo-Nazi-led Azov battalion, which is regiment, and other Ukrainian forces not to withdraw from Mariupol and to continue fighting against Russian forces until their surrender and imprisonment by Russia. And later Zelensky also gave similar order to continue fighting for Lysychansk and Severodonetsk, which is again, even so there was a real danger of surrender by Russian encirclement of these cities in Donbass as well. And so this is the latest, I think, manifestation of this policy was by Zelensky was his decision to to launch a military operation over Dnieper River in Kherson area, try to move and advance to Crimea from Kherson area, and over Dnieper River, which is again by using amphibious, basically offensive, which is I think again is not successful. Ukrainian forces were able to establish small platform in one or two villages near this river, but it would be very difficult to advance to Crimea from this area, because Dnieper River, even after this Kakhovka Dam was blown up, is still a significant river. It's a very large river, which prevents Ukrainian forces from being able to supply and to transfer their weapons and military personnel to across this river for major counteroffensive in this area. But I think this is for Zelensky, it was major public relations motivation to do this, to show that he would be able to again defeat Russia by surprise and so on. And this is one of the reasons of tensions between military and Ukrainian military commanders and Zelensky, because they resist his, or try to give other suggestions, other policies, and or to try to resist his policies, which lead to very significant casualties, like in case of Bakhmut, in case of this Dnieper River counteroffensive, and also in case of Severodonetsk and other similar cases. And I think even Times Magazine recently had article about Zelensky by Simon Schuster, which received a lot of media attention in Ukraine, coverage in Ukraine, because he mentions that Zelensky gave order to Ukrainian military to take to launch counteroffensive and take back Hordiivka city, which is near Donetsk, and the military refused to such order. They said there are no sufficient resources, no people for such a counteroffensive in this area, which is heavily defended by Russian forces, which is, I think, quite consistent with statement by Zelensky, who said during his recent visit to the United States that Ukraine would be able to take back two cities from Russia in a short time. And I think Lvivka was one city, and probably Bakhmut was another city, because also he ordered again to Ukrainian forces to try to take back Bakhmut, and this also counteroffensive there also failed. And even so, now Bakhmut is basically totally destroyed. There is no military value in this, but it's big political value for Zelensky, trying to show again to the public, to Ukrainians, and to the media that he's still like a Churchill. He's still kind of very successful and so on in defeating Russia. But this is, I think, was obvious for a very long time that he's not in such category. He's just motivated by public relations, and there's very significant consequences of such policies which have on Ukraine and Ukrainians, because a lot of people are getting killed, and Ukraine's future now is in quite pessimistic and in doubt because of of the decision by Zelensky basically to kind of engage in such policies and kind of trying to basically to double down on the policies even after the failure of these policies and such strategy, which he's not a military expert, but he tries to kind of command over military commanders. And now there are reports that he already plans to replace either Zaluzhny or other top commanders in Ukrainian military. And some of them might be even charged with a variety of crimes, or kind of accused of a variety of crimes and investigated and put in prison. And I think this is another kind of policy of Zelensky to try to imprison anybody who would go against him, or trying to show that he's still in command and still kind of is able to kind of control situation in Ukraine and in this war.
Yeah, I mean, it would be interesting to see if the West would actually go along with some of these like more obviously political prosecutions, because the West seems to like want to maintain a little bit of plausible deniability, but specifically on the rift between Valery Zaluzhny and Zelensky. So like Zaluzhny's most recently in the news because he gave this big interview where he was just like more or less saying, look, this war is a stalemate. The only way that we could have a serious breakthrough is if we have a serious technological breakthrough, which might never come. And soon after that interview, there was Zaluzhny's aide. I'm not sure if he got killed, but he received some sort of a gift, right? Like a gift of like, it seemed like maybe toy grenades or whatever it was, turned out to be real grenades. And the aide either, correct me if I'm wrong, either got hurt or got killed. Was this like specifically meant for Zaluzhny? Like what is the, a chatter about all this? Like, what are the theories about what transpired and why? Is this just kind of like a means of taking out the guy that is, poo-pooing the war effort, or was this like random, or was there something else going on?
I do not know what actually happened in this case because I have just public information. So I just read public reports about this quite unusual case, and I think a very suspicious case, but it's very difficult to know actually what happened without knowing the evidence and all the background to this story. But I think it was quite extraordinary in any case that one of senior aides to Zaluzhny would give a gift of military grenades made in Germany to another aide of Zaluzhny as a birthday present, which is now official story. And an official investigation said that again almost immediately that this this gift was kind of military weapons. This was that Zaluzhny aide who gave this gift. He specifically mentioned that these were like real grenades. This was real ammunition which can blow up and so on. But they said that another aide of Zaluzhny who received this gift as a birthday present, he believes that they were just like glasses for wine, for drinking whiskey, which he also received as a present. So he just opened this and tried to pull the plug when his child was playing with them, which is, I think, quite unbelievable, because if he gave this grenade, live grenade, to his child to play on, I think, and afterwards there was explosion, and this aide to Zelensky was to Zaluzhny was killed, and his child was badly injured during this kind of quite extraordinary event. So I'm not sure. Again, this looks kind of, it might be accident, but again, it will be very strange to see that military kind of one of the most senior military officials in Ukraine in terms of kind of being close to Zaluzhny at the time when there is an open conflict between Zaluzhny and Zelensky, he would just accept kind of such present, and another person would give such present, and they would not, and the person who received such present would not know that these are real military grenades, would not be able to distinguish between, again, real grenade and kind of and glass, like in form of grenade, which is obviously there are different weight and so on. But I think I think maybe this was one of the reasons for this is because these grenades were from Germany, which had some plastic were used in terms of plastic, not metal grenades, and this may be one reason for such confusion, and especially if there was a birthday, so he might be drunk. So this is maybe such explanation. And another explanation would be that this was assassination, specifically trying to kind of kill trying to remove two aides of Zaluzhny at the same time. And again, there is no evidence for this, but I think it will be a very strange coincidence, like taking place at the very time when there is open rift between Zaluzhny and Zelensky. So I think it will be very difficult to know now which version of this is is real. But I think if you would receive more information about this, it might be then possible to make kind of more conclusive evidence. I personally do not know. I'm not certain what actually happened. I think but it's a very strange story which might have implications because of its political effect. And a lot of oppositions, like from even in Ukraine, to Zelensky, started to using this story basically immediately saying this was assassination linked to Zelensky, trying to basically go after Zaluzhny and his aides.
Well, one funny detail about all this that I'm not sure if you noticed, but in some of the translations of these stories from Russian, it gets translated as toy pomegranates or like gift pomegranates, because there's a lot of the Russian word for pomegranate and grenade is actually very similar. So when they translate it back, I guess automatically some of these articles say that he received pomegranates that exploded, which might be pretty confusing to readers, but that's why. So I guess we could soon move to the Maidan massacre updates. But before we do that, do you have anything that you want to say about just kind of the status of the Ukraine war going forward? Are we now going to be in a situation where, the West is just going to be emphatic about you have to sue for peace? And if so, like, what are these peace deals like? What might they look like? Is there actually willingness in the part of Putin to negotiate now? There seems to have been willingness early on in the war, but at this point, I mean, it's very feasible. I think that like it's kind of like crazy to say, but when it comes to all the conflicts that we could list, whether it's like the Gaza conflict or whatever, the war in Iraq, the actual like civilian death toll of the war in Ukraine seems to be pretty low, and I don't think it's like it's not like Putin is not above, for instance, trying to do something that would humiliate Biden in 2024, right, for the sake of the elections by really upping the ante in that way and killing more civilians. And it seems like much of the global South might sort of stand behind Putin in these kinds of actions simply because he gave himself intentionally, it seems like, a lot of wiggle room in terms of like he could point to like, well, the civilian death toll is actually much lower and we're taking equal casualties, in terms of Ukrainian and Russian soldiers. So like what do you think is going to happen going forward, and what are these peace deals? What might they look like?
No, in terms of civilian casualties in Ukraine, the latest UN report, which was published on, I think, October 7, was October 8, had there were casualties, confirmed casualties on the Ukrainian government-controlled territory of about 7,000 civilians, and 3,000 civilians were killed on Russian-controlled territory. So kind of more civilians killed on the Ukrainian territory, but now the number of civilians killed in each month declined to about 140 or about 150 confirmed casualties, and I think very interesting. Again, it is still very significant, but there is nothing comparison, for instance, even to war in Bosnia. In Bosnia, things were a much bigger number of casualties taking place during this war. So, and in case of, I think very interesting that after the Gaza conflict started, there was no update from the United Nations about civilian casualties in Ukraine. I think this is also very, very interesting.
Yeah, for like a month. They stopped updating. Yeah.
Yes, and this is quite unusual as well. And I think this also, this also has very implications because kind of this was presented. This war was presented basically as kind of as planned to kind of Putin again to take over entire Ukraine, to destroy Ukrainian nations and so on, kind of target civilians. But again, I think kind of now again, kind of it will be very difficult, kind of to, especially for other countries and for the media, to justify this kind of continuation of this war by basically appealing for supporting Ukrainians and against kind of Russian policy of trying to kind of kill all Ukrainians or kind of or annihilate Ukrainian nations and so on, which was propaganda at the start of this conflict. And a lot of like academics, even who are not experts, like or some who in other areas like Timothy Snyder, who is a historian but was very active in commenting about this, and even some other kind of academics who became just kind of like activists and more than scholars. They also kind of perpetrated this kind of propaganda that there is basically genocide against Ukrainians taking place and so on, and this policy of Putin is kind of his mass annihilation, like almost like Hitler, Nazi Germany, and so on. And now I think it will be very difficult to justify this kind of policy. But again, the number of military casualties are much more significant in Ukraine, and this is, I think, now supported by a variety of data. Even so, still for Ukraine and Ukrainians, this is a very significant conflict, and most casualties are kind of a result of Russian shelling, kind of using again like shells, artillery, shelling, missiles, and so on, which are, I think, which are kind of impact also areas with civilians, like in cities, or kind of civilian population in areas during the battles, kind of in villages and towns like Bakhmut and so on. But this is, I think, nothing comparable with war in Bosnia or even with Gaza in terms of magnitude of the casualties, civilian casualties, or even much more, nothing compatible with World War II. I think this is, like a scholar, I think very important to kind of to note this, because this was used to misrepresent and to justify basically a proxy war in Ukraine, basically to say that there is no choice for Ukraine. Is basically, this is like a war for survival, like World War II, and because Russia would kill all the Ukrainians or just capture all Ukraine and so on, and annihilate Ukrainian nation. And this is actually, I don't think this was a real outcome. And I think I mentioned the goal of Russia was trying to kind of to make a deal, to force Ukraine to make a deal, and to declare neutrality of Ukraine, to kind of to recognize annexation of Crimea and Donbass by Russia, and Russia, or to have a regime change in Ukraine into pro-Russian government on the remaining part of Ukraine. And I think kind of Russia had and Ukraine negotiated such deal in spring of 2022, and it was very close to being completed. But Western countries basically told Zelensky not to kind of implement such a deal or to sign such a deal. This was revealed by ex-Israeli Prime Minister, by ex-Leader of Germany, and by officials close to Zelensky, and even to, again, other sources like Turkish foreign minister and so on. So this was basically United States decision and decision of other like countries of NATO, like United Kingdom, not to have a peace deal and to continue proxy war. And I think this is very important because this would mean that decision to kind of and policy either to continue this war in Ukraine or to make a peace deal with Russia and accept much worse conditions for Ukraine as a result of such peace deal now would be decided by the West, by the United States. It's not like they talk about, so this is like Ukrainian decision, the sovereignty and so on, or what they call this, I forgot, it's like, what the name they call it, like autonomy or kind of. This is basically only decision of Ukrainian government, but in practice, this is not how this is works, and this is actually would be decision by U.S. government, by Biden administration, either to continue this war, trying to achieve stalemate, basically, which will be the only possibility, but I think it's not very realistic in the long term. But still, kind of, they might achieve this policy if they want to weaken Russia. So the longer war continues in Ukraine, even without any possibility of Ukrainian victory over Russia, this still will be beneficial to the West and to Biden administration, especially before elections, to justify this. So I think this is one possible strategy by Biden and by the West in general, because Western countries like Germany, United Kingdom, and even France, they just follow policy of the United States in concerning war in Ukraine. Another possibility is for negotiations, basically, and there are some reports that that Western officials started already suggesting that Zelensky would resume negotiations with Russia. But I think now any negotiations, even if they will be resumed by Zelensky, which is I think would be very difficult for him because of his kind of promise to defeat Russia. Now basically he would have to kind of resort to negotiations, and immediately he would face opposition from the far right in Ukraine, from hardline nationalists in Ukraine, because he promised opposite, and any negotiations with Russia basically would mean recognition that his policy failed already. But then another issue would be what kind of peace deal could be achieved, and any peace deal now which can be signed would mean conditions which will be much more kind of difficult to accept, or even kind of much more negative to Ukraine in terms of future and impact compared to any peace deal which could have been reached in spring of 2022. Because now Russia, I think if they would accept peace deal, they would demand not only neutrality of Ukraine, demilitarization of Ukraine, and making even like Russian second language, which is maybe their policy, but also they would demand recognition of annexation not only of Crimea and Donbass, but also the regions which were annexed already by Russia, like part of Kherson and Zaporizhia region, and they might have other territory. They might demand other territory like Odessa region and Kharkiv region as a part of a peace deal. So this is, I think, would be very negative consequences to Ukraine if such peace deal would be signed. So I think there are choice now either to continue this war and trying to weaken Russia by this will be Western policy, and Zelensky might accept this again because alternative would be to start negotiations and to sign a peace deal, which would be again very negative to Ukraine. So again, I think but I think in terms of Ukrainians and future of Ukraine, any peace deal would be still beneficial because continuation of the war would just delay basically inevitable. So even the war would continue, the longer it would continue, the much less favorable outcome for Ukraine would be when the war would end. And this would mean again many people killed, very significant military casualties, because now military casualties are very significant. I read each day obituaries in my native Volhynian region, newspapers. Now several soldiers are killed from this region each day, which can be kind of estimated on entire Ukraine, which will be about more than 3,000 military casualties each month at least. So this means again very heavy just killed of Ukrainian forces, so, and compared again to much lower civilian casualties. But I think this is very significant impact, and if war continue, it will be very difficult to kind of for Ukraine to end this war on any favorable terms, and it will be much worse outcome even compared to what would be possible now. So I think now in Ukraine, quite pessimistic about future of Ukraine. even so, the kind of Zelensky would still try to present that everything is fine. There is no stalemate. There is still possibility of victory, but I think the outcome is already quite certain that there is a kind of a big problem for Ukraine in terms of this war, and this is just time, just how soon it will be recognized by the West and by Zelensky.
And I mean, just to be fair, maybe I'm just too suspicious of a person here, but speaking of the March, April negotiations of 2022 last year, just like some of the figures involved, so the German ex-prime minister Gerhard Schroeder, I mean, I think there's reasons to be suspicious of anything that he says in terms of negotiations, simply his own like Russia-related scandals in the past. Naftali Bennett, you know, I'm not sure if I consider him like very credible, just given his behavior over the past year and a half, but especially over the last month or so. But this at the same time, it also would be interesting if, like, you know, as time passes, if Putin completes this kind of realignment towards Palestine, it would be interesting to see if suddenly Bennett has a different recollection from how March, April 2022 played out. But there's also, you know, obviously there's like Turkish officials that corroborate the idea that there was a peace deal on the table, and Zelensky and Putin were both willing to do so. And then, you know, there was this kind of like Western pressure to not go through with it. But it will be interesting to see basically what would happen going forward. And I just wanted to get those details there, because as I was researching the specifics of the negotiations, you know, I just had like the sinking feeling like, you know, there's not really people that I would trust all that much. But again, you know, there are multiple officials, and that obviously carries weight, right? They were the ones doing the negotiations. They were allowed in. So you have to lend some credibility to these words. But maybe we can move specifically to...
if I can just briefly add to this, because original publication about this peace deal and negotiations that were ended, and specifically that they were ended by kind of British Prime Minister Boris Johnson, was in Ukrainian media, in Ukrainska Pravda, which is main like Ukrainian newspaper. And this publication was based on sources from officials close to Zelensky. So this basically Ukrainian government officials gave such information and published this information first. And I published this article on Twitter. I reported this article on Twitter, which was originally published in Ukrainian language, and it became immediately again kind of viral tweet. And this is was first mentioning of this peace deal, kind of which was close to been successful, and there were many other reports in Western media and other sources before this kind of Ukrainian publications that these negotiations were very close to success, and that they included such provisions like neutrality of Ukraine. So this is not only kind of information from these two leaders, like politicians, but also from Ukrainian sources and close to Zelensky, and from other Western media before this. So I think now this is quite well documented. There was such clear possibility of such peace deal, and the Western countries basically blocked this. And this was a decision by Biden administration and also by British Prime Minister to continue proxy war in Ukraine instead of having a peace deal for Ukraine.
Yeah, I actually forgot the Boris Johnson angle, but same thing applies to Maidan Massacre, where I was reading more in the last few days, and it seems like every single interview that I came across, or more kind of documentation as to what transpired February 20th, 2014. You know, there's so many layers to it, and I just want to frame this first of all as just seeing some of the kind of chatter around your specific claims online. I think we should like stress from the get-go that you never claimed, for example, that there was no involvement of, you know, Yanukovych, like police forces in the shooting, right? In fact, like you left open the possibility that they were eventually involved if they were like shot upon first, or maybe there was some other kind of escalation. So you never had a claim from the beginning that absolutely, you know, we cannot take seriously any claims that there was any sort of like police shooting or, you know, police related either murders or killings, or however you want to frame a given situation there. So, just to get that out of the way. But
yes, this is correct. Yeah, so I do not exclude such possibility. In some cases, the Berkut police shot protesters either in crossfire or as a kind of just as a result of ricochet or some other such a way. So,
can you actually just give us like this maybe like a timeline of either the main trial that transpired, or even maybe some of the kind of, it seems like there was kind of like secondary trials or at least investigations. How exactly did like all of those transpire? Why did it take so long? It seems like there is like some evidence at least of a cover up in the sense of like, there was like evidence that was destroyed, right? There was tons of like ballistic information and forensic analysis that never made it into the trial for whatever reason. But there were also just tons of witness corroboration. I mean, lots of people, we're not talking about one or two, we're talking about dozens and dozens and dozens. And in fact, one thing that kind of shocked me going through some of your videos is the number of witnesses. They were like Maidan protesters, right? They were protesting against Yanukovych, and how many of them, just like in all, like we're talking about Belgian TV programs, we're talking about Russian, language, Ukrainian, how many of them were just kind of saying that, yeah, there were snipers specifically in that building, this was Maidan controlled, that was Maidan controlled. And, it hit, people around me. Like it was actually a very common refrain. And also it seems like just, we wouldn't know about this like outside of Ukraine, I guess, but, you researching this, you would have more awareness. It seems as if for a long time, and maybe even to this day, there was a lot of controversy specifically about who was responsible for, if not primarily, then at least like a big chunk of the Maidan killings, right? It was not dismissed out of hand, for instance, the idea that some of the like right-wing protesters that eventually, formed the kind of Maidan muscle. That's why they became politically popular. Even if they couldn't win elections, they have a lot of outsized influence in Ukraine now, simply because they're considered like, well, we provided the muscle for the Maidan revolution, which is what got us to this point now. So you have to respect us. And it seemed like it wasn't very controversial to say that, they probably were involved in some way, shooting at protesters and trying to create these escalations. So just I'll use that as a framing device, and you could sort of give the recent revelations with the conclusion of the trial.
Well, this actually, so this is my main theory, which my main finding of my academic studies, which now published in the form of peer-reviewed articles, journal articles, and in the form of book chapter by academic press, and now my book would be published by another major Western academic press about Maidan Massacre, just entirely a book about this massacre. And so what I found, based on my research, that there was involvement of right and oligarchic elements of Maidan leadership and snipers in this massacre, and then at least absolute majority of Maidan protesters and the police, they were massacred by snipers who were based in the Hotel Ukraina and other Maidan control locations. Specifically to blame, firstly to blame police forces for this massacre, or government forces to blame them for this massacre, and to overthrow Yanukovych. And this is, I think, very kind of. This was regarded as conspiracy theory, dismissed as conspiracy theory, that this is kind of by persecution, Ukrainian persecution. They said there were no snipers located in any building. This was like totally kind of false. And even the Maidan lawyers said the same, and even major media, like Western media, also claimed that this is like conspiracy theory. Kind of, they did not mention my studies specifically for this reason, because they kind of but and also major Ukrainian media and a lot of politicians, they basically denied that there were any snipers, and they either were silent or they denied this, or tried to whitewash any evidence which was publicly available, like videos even from BBC of Maidan sniper shooting into BBC crew, which was video which was available for a long time, but they tried to kind of whitewash this and saying this is like that Maidan forces do not control Hotel Ukraina and so on, and this was just basically just another conspiracy theory to say that the Maidan forces killed kind of any Maidan protesters. And so now, as a result of this very long trial, which took place in Ukraine since 2015, they considered this massacre only Maidan protesters. They did not look into massacre of the police. and they only examined massacre of about half of wounded protesters, because another half kind of persecution said they were shot by somebody else. And so they basically nobody, and they still said, so basically you have almost like I think 77 wounded protesters were shot by somebody else, and nobody charged with them, so nobody even asked any questions. So this is just normal. So, and this is kind of was already basically official admission that there were some snipers who shot kind of these protesters, because even persecution would not charge anybody with their wounding. And this trial was specifically delayed deliberately by Ukrainian government.
And Poroshenko was one of the people that was implicated in the delays, yeah?
Yeah, and Poroshenko as well, and even Zelensky, because Zelensky specifically exchanged 5 Bakhmut members who were tried for this massacre of Maidan protesters to Donbass separatists in 2019. And this trial was almost ready to issue decisions, so they were very close, just a few months before the decision verdict. And then Zelensky gave order to the judges, basically to prosecutors, to exchange all the Bakhmut policemen who were charged with the massacre to Donbass separatists. And after 2 of them returned on their own from Donbass, separatists controlled Donbass, to face trial, so the trial would resume. So but it took almost 2 years, just a break before this trial was resumed, and they issued decision just last month. Their verdict, which is, I think, was also quite unprecedented, because all the media reports in the West and in Ukraine about this verdict, initially they removed any kind of reference to any snipers, any kind of Maidan snipers, which kind of now confirmed by this verdict, trial decision officially in Ukraine. And this was not accidental, because I think this goes against all the narrative presented about this massacre as basically as mass murder of protesters by the police or government snipers on Yanukovych orders. So this was official narrative, and now we have a official trial decision, which states, and this is what exactly I found. It states categorical conclusion that there were like persons with weapons in Hotel Ukraine, and they were using these weapons and shooting these weapons. And they said this kind of, and they specifically said that also the Hotel Ukraine was controlled by Maidan activists during this massacre, which is another kind of variety of kind of all this kind of self-proclaimed experts and others like this Katie Young, some journalist who publishes this Bulwark and so on. She claims that Hotel Ukraine was not controlled by anybody and so on. And now we have official decision based on my own research, which is confirms my own research, which states that Hotel Ukraine was controlled by Maidan activists. So this is now official court decision, and again, but nobody reported this. They're still unreported with I think, with exception of a few small media outlets. And this is, I think, very crucial, because I wrote in my studies that Far Right Svoboda, before the massacre, they officially issued a statement on their website, which said they took Hotel Ukraine under their control and guard. And they guarded this hotel. According to my studies, there are like videos of them guarding entrance to this hotel during the massacre. You have Svoboda deputies there. So this was open kind of evidence that this hotel was guarded and controlled by Maidan forces, specifically Far Right Svoboda party, which now you have confirmation from Ukrainian official trial verdicts that this was controlled by not by any government. There were no government forces involved in this massacre. They also said there were no Russian snipers involved in this massacre, which was another conspiracy theory trying to talk. They might have been Russian snipers and so on. But now we have official trial decision saying there were no government forces in Hotel Ukraine. It was controlled not by government forces. It was controlled by Maidan activists, and that there were people with weapons in this Hotel Ukraine, and that they also stated openly, they stated explicitly that there were at least 3 protesters, Maidan activists, killed from the Hotel Ukraine. So this is official court decision, and they said that 3 Maidan activists were killed from the Hotel Ukraina, at least because they named them specifically, and saying there were others whose circumstances are not certain, or that involvement of government forces and Berkut specifically is excluded from in their killing. So there could have been more confirmations that other protesters were killed according to this verdict, and they specifically said that these protesters were shot deliberately. And in another case, the trial decision also states quite explicitly that BBC television crew was shot from the Hotel Ukraina direction. They said like side from Hotel Ukraina, which is consistent with video when BBC crew was shot from the Hotel Ukraina, and they specifically pointed to window on 11th floor of this hotel and said that there was a sniper who was wearing a Maidan style helmet, green helmet. And now decision from official court decision states specifically that this BBC television crew was shot at from the Hotel Ukraina, and this was evidence that this was actually documented.
And yeah, that is a video from March 2014. Actually, you could find it right now on the BBC website. And yeah, the journalist is he's speaking and saying, we were shot at. I recognize this person here wearing these clothes, wearing this, I think it was a helmet or a hat that is specifically like Maidan. And yeah, he's directly like making that statement, and you could watch that now. And I don't think that video had any sort of airplay back then. It's the first time I came across it earlier this week.
Oh yes, and I think this is also very important because now we have official trial verdict, which I posted on my website, which I also gonna post all these references to the snipers in Hotel Ukraina on my website. So this specifically states that this was evidence that there were targeted shooting by Maidan shooters from the Hotel Ukraina, which was controlled by Maidan activists. This trial verdict, they stated that Berkut police was responsible for murder of 31 out of 49 protesters who were killed on February 20th, and that they were responsible for deliberate attempted murder of 44 protesters who were wounded out of 80. All protesters, and they said that commander of Berkut commander was responsible for murder of manslaughter of 4 protesters at the start of this massacre, when these protesters were shot accidentally as a result of indiscriminate fire shooting by Berkut police. But I think this decision basically to convict 3 members of Berkut, including Berkut commander, for the murder of these protesters is based on single piece of decision or a single piece of evidence, which is a forensic ballistic examination of bullets, which was conducted in 2019. Again, at the last moment when Poroshenko was still in power, and shortly before elections. And this forensic examination of bullets linked bullets which were extracted from bodies of killed protesters to bullets from Berkut police, but not the police who were charged with massacre of protesters, but other policemen who were not charged, who were not facing the trial, and so this is like this one piece of forensic evidence was used basically to blame all the Berkut collectively, all the Berkut members collectively for the massacre of Maidan protesters, even of most Maidan protesters, according to this decision. But this again, this is, and I mentioned this in my studies even before this Maidan massacre trial. This forensic examination is clearly fraudulent or falsified, because it reversed about 40 other forensic examination of bullets without any explanation. So you have 40 other examination of bullets which were conducted by Ukrainian government experts, and they were totally changed by another examination which was conducted even by the same experts, including the same experts, without any explanation why they did this. So again, so this is quite extraordinary, because original examination of bullets which were extracted from bodies of Maidan protesters who were killed during this massacre and other locations, they did not match any bullet to Berkut to Berkut weapons, and this examination was conducted by computer-based systems, so there was no involvement of people, of humans in this case, and I think it's very important because kind of in Ukraine corruption is very strong, and these experts who conducted the latest examination were kind of basically part of government institute. So this is kind of so you can basically buy any decision, and especially or you can order such decision from the top, because kind of in UK corruption is even in justice system is very significant, and everybody knows this. This is quite open evidence, and this is why kind of this is just one example of this. But another example why this is fraudulent decision is because video which I examined, which I synchronized, all the videos of Berkut police shooting, and when they were shooting, and when protesters were killed, such videos are available and synchronized them, and they were also synchronized by another group which was hired by a prosecutor general office, but did this anonymously, and they paid them to do this, but without releasing their names and identity, and this synchronized videos were used by the judges and jury to convict kind of Berkut policemen for the massacre of Maidan protesters. And all the videos which are synchronized independently by me and by this group, kind of which was connected actually to oligarchic Maidan politicians who actually were involved in this massacre, they show that specific times when Berkut police were shooting did not coincide with specific times when specific protesters were killed. So with I think with just few exceptions. And I think it's also very revealing that Maidan Massacre trial verdict, which they mention this in a kind of model from Situ, New York architectural company, which was published and publicized by New York Times as clear evidence that Berkut was responsible for the massacre of Maidan protesters, because they're looking to see cases of protesters who were killed. And now the trial specifically said that this evidence was introduced by Maidan victims' lawyers. But he said that they wasted basically time by introducing this evidence for a few days during the trial, and later they decided not to present this evidence. So this was not used as evidence because specifically Maidan lawyers, they decided not to use the evidence which they requested commission from this architecture company in New York State, in New York City, as a main evidence that Berkut was responsible for the massacre. But they decided not to introduce this evidence because, as I mentioned in my own studies and my publications, this was very clear, even without any kind of basic knowledge, that this was falsified also kind of model, because they changed locations of bullet holes or bullet wounds in these protesters in different. They moved them into different locations specifically to match positions of Berkut, and so this was very obvious that this was falsified, and for this reason they did not kind of use this Situ model of reconstruction, kind of, which was publicized by New York Times and a lot of other media, basically as clear evidence that they were responsible. The Maidan protesters were killed by Berkut police, and now Maidan lawyers who commissioned this specifically kind of refused to even to introduce this as evidence, to kind of use this as evidence during the trial. Even so, this was purpose of this kind of a model, which was paid actually by Soros Foundation, and they paid close to $100,000 US dollars for this model. And so this is quite unbelievable, and also I think also very revealing that a trial decision stated that prosecution refused to or did not conduct ballistic examinations on site by ballistic experts to determine locations of shooters on site of the massacre. So basically to have reconstruction to determine ballistic trajectories by ballistic experts, and they said this was a very primitive this was a very basic task, very kind of straightforward task to do for prosecution, and trial and Maidan Massacre trial ordered them to do this, but prosecution basically did not conduct this for more than 2 years, and they refused basically to do this, claiming a variety of claims which are quite extraordinary. They said that they could not use students because students were busy going to university, studying in university, and having them summer vacations and so on. So they could not conduct this. They could not use ballistic experts to determine reconstruction from which locations protesters were shot at, and I think this is very clear that this was not just accident, because you can just claim, it's very easy to claim something without, if you just write something, and because most people would not look into detail, would not know the location and all the kind of information to kind of connect this, all the information which I did in my studies, kind of collected all such information. But if you try to kind of to show on site location of the shooters, it would not be possible to do this, because it would become immediately clear that there's bullet matches which were kind of used as main evidence in forensic examination. The Bakhmut police massacred this Maidan protesters actually based on false information, because matches this would not match location of Bakhmut, but would clearly match location of snipers, because bullet wounds in all cases of the killed protesters actually from a very steep direction, not from the ground on which Bakhmut was located, and not from the front, but bullet locations are from the side direction and from top to bottom direction, and also from back direction. So protesters were shot in the back, and there are now recognition by official verdicts that protesters were killed in the back by shots who were specifically aimed to kill them from the Hotel Ukraine. Again, which was controlled by Maidan activists, but there is no investigation, nothing conducted, and I think the reason why prosecution did not conduct this ballistic experiments by kind of ballistic reconstruction by ballistic experiments by ballistic experts, even so there was a decision by judges, by the jury, to conduct such kind of examinations, was because the first such examinations which were conducted by experts determined that protesters were shot from Hotel Ukraine and other Maidan control locations, and for this reason, obviously, they could not continue doing this, and that's why they refused to implement this court decision and did not conduct even the basic kind of basic task, using ballistic experts to determine bullet trajectory that killed Maidan protesters. And I think this is not accidental. This is like dogs that did not bark in Conan Doyle novels, because it's very clear that this is kind of like in case videos, which again used to kind of misrepresent this, because police were shooting, but the police were shooting not into protesters, they were shooting again, and the court and the decision recognizes that they were shooting in the ground first, and they were shooting also in Hotel Ukraine, because this is again not accidental, because now trial decision recognized that there were snipers located in this Hotel Ukraine, and they were shooting Maidan protesters from this location. So this is, I think, quite extraordinary to have all this information now. And again, there is a total media blackout, and there are no investigations, no calls from even prosecution of people who committed mass murder, basically in Ukraine, and there are basically nobody is interested in this to determine who was responsible, actually who shot their own protesters from the Hotel Ukraine, which was controlled by Maidan activists, and this kind of and people who claim this was conspiracy theory and deny this and attack me and try to smear me for my research, academic research, now either silent or totally silent, or they continue to claim that the court decision did not have any kind of refuted all this evidence that there were snipers in Hotel Ukraine and so on, they shot Maidan protesters, or that Hotel Ukraine was controlled by Maidan activists. Even so, this is clear opposite. Everything is written and the text is available, and I publish this, and I'm going to publish this in my academic venues. I'm going to include this kind of verdict in my book, in my popular publications, and again, I publish this kind of this evidence also on social media, on Twitter, and on my Facebook account.
So I actually do have some questions about, I guess, like some of the more common objections to your Maidan research, as well as some questions. I'm not sure if you ever heard this name, Ivan Bubinchik. You probably have. He was one of the Maidan protesters that did, in fact, and did admit to killing at least one police officer by shooting him in the back of the head. And there's this weird Ukrainian law that prevent his prosecution due to the fact that Maidan-related incidents were specifically not prosecuted because of this law. And we could get into that maybe for the patrons afterwards. But let's just, for right now, end with your, maybe you could introduce the book that you're working on. I recently donated some money to the crowd funding effort that you're doing for a book on kind of like the roots of the Russia-Ukraine war. I'm guessing you would start like primarily with the 90s and move onwards, which is of interest to me simply because if you look at a lot of the documentation about Russia from the 90s up until I would say maybe 2008, when Western perspective started to shift, you get a lot of interesting stuff about Russia that now would be kind of ignored or downplayed in different ways. So maybe you could just briefly talk about the book that you're working on now.
So I actually have 3 books, which would be.
Well, I mean the Russia Ukraine, the roots of the war.
Yes, so the book which is you mentioned and which I touch publishes open access is an entire book, or chapter by chapter, is actually called from the Maidan to the Russia-Ukraine war, and it looks into origins of this conflict going back to Maidan and Maidan Massacre, and then look into other conflicts like Donbass, war in Donbass, Crimean annexation, far right in Ukraine, and then kind of involvement in this wars and conflict, and in the Russia-Ukraine war, and finally would have examination of Russia-Ukraine war based on my research. So this is kind of a book which will be published by major Western kind of academic press, and I have deadline of submitting this book manuscript, final manuscript, in 2 months. And I have most of my manuscript is ready, and I'm just finishing this and still doing research, but kind of trying to crowdfund this funding to making this book open access, is as entire book, or as depending on funding, or as chapters or key chapters to make it open access. And I already was successful in getting funding for my open access Maidan Massacre articles, which were published open access by peer-reviewed journals, and so the parts of their text would be included in my book and published in my book for this reason, because kind of it's easier to get if you have open access, it's easier to republish them as open access without permission, without seeking permission or paying fees to the publishers. But I think it's very important to make this information public, because already my Maidan Massacre articles, open access articles, have received almost 100,000 views and downloads of entire text. So I hope my book would be also published as open access in its entirety, or depending on funding, or chapter by chapter. There's also such possibility. And this book actually examines into how conflict started, violent conflict started in Ukraine, going back to Maidan Massacre, and how it escalated into Russian annexation of Crimea, into overthrow of Yanukovych, and the civil war in Donbass, Russian military interventions in Donbass, and role of far right in this conflict, and also finally how how Russia dramatically escalated this conflict into kind of a war between Russia and Ukraine in 2022 by invading Ukraine, and how this also became a proxy war between Russia and the West in Ukraine. So this is like all comprehensive examination of conflicts in Ukraine going back to Maidan and its origins. But I'm also looking before this, kind of in my studies, looking to all the issues which are mentioned by scholars, issue of democracy, if Ukraine is democracy, which is kind of a claim which is often repeated. So I'm looking to kind of this issue as well, and looking to regional divisions in Ukraine and far right in Ukraine. So going back in terms of developments, but I think this is very crucial kind of period for this conflict is from the Maidan Massacre, because this led to kind of to such spiral, kind of escalation ladder of conflicts, which ended with this devastating war between Russia and Ukraine, which is also now a very dangerous proxy war, which has tremendous and very negative consequences for Ukraine and Ukrainians because of this conflict, which is, I think, still kind of going back to far-right involvement. And you mentioned Bubyanchik, Ivan Bubyanchik. Actually, I was the first one who reported his involvement in this Maidan Massacre in my paper, which I presented in the American Political Science Association annual conference in 2015 in San Francisco. I mentioned his interview, in which first interview, which he gave to Lviv television in Western Ukraine, in which he admitted basically shooting police from Kalashnikov. And so again, and later, in a few years afterwards, he publicly admitted in the Ukrainian media that he was shooting and killing police, Bakhmut police, and now he's not investigating. He was, again, there was no investigation.
Yeah, let's not give it all away. Maybe we should just like move on for the interest of time.
Yes.
But yeah, well, for the patrons, I'm going to have some comments on Palestine and Russia. I've been listening to some Russian state radio, Russian propaganda radio, however you want to phrase it, the past week, and I'm very intrigued by their coverage of Palestine, which is very different from what I'm used to, even coming out of Russia, frankly. We could talk more about this Ivan Bubenchik character and some of the laws surrounding what he did. More in Maidan, some very ominous developments coming out of Dmitry Medvedev. And I want to talk about him as a maybe figure in Russia and some of the comments that he's been making about, capturing all of Ukraine and so on and so forth, and see where that would go. Also kind of just like Ukraine's future, I guess, whether or not it could shake off the status as essentially a vassal state and what that would look like. And maybe we'll have a couple other things too. So for patrons, that's patreon.com/automacination. For everybody else, thank you for sticking with us. And patrons, we will see you soon.